Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Beyond Extrapolation Using Additional Inputs to Improve Forecast Accuracy. My name is Sabina Kadar, and I'm going to be the moderator for today. Now, we'll begin the webinar shortly, but first, I'll go over a few logistics. So the webinar presentation is going to run approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll save time at the end for Q&A. Now, during the webinar, you can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time, so feel free to submit them as they come to you. I'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar, and we'll compile a list for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We'll also be taking questions submitted during the Q&A session itself. Now, we will do our best to address as many questions as possible in the time allotted, but if we don't get to your question, don't worry. You'll receive a follow-up email from us after the conclusion of the webinar. We also will be recording this webinar, and we'll email you a link to the video sometime next week when it's available for on-demand viewing. This webinar will be posted to both the Forecast Pro website as well as our YouTube channel. And here you can actually find a full archive of our past webinars. These are all free, and they're a great way to catch up on any webinars that you may have missed. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eric Stellwagen to introduce himself and kick off today's webinar, Beyond Extrapolation Using Additional Inputs to Improve Forecast Accuracy.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sabina. As Sabina mentioned, my name is Eric, and I am a co-founder and the CEO of Business Forecast Systems, which is the company that develops and markets the Forecast Pro software. I've actually spent basically the entirety of my professional career in the area of business forecasting. I got started back in 1984, actually. And I have had the opportunity to work with literally hundreds and hundreds of companies to help them improve their forecasting process and their forecast accuracy. So today's topic is entitled Beyond Extrapolation. There's an awful lot of forecasting that is performed using extrapolation. And basically, you take the demand history for what you're trying to forecast, and you run it through an algorithm, whether it's exponential smoothing or a spreadsheet, like same as last year, plus a percentage or something like that. But the main concept of extrapolation is that we're going to use the past to predict the future. Today's presentation is about methods that do more than just use the past. So I'm going to refer to extrapolation sometimes as a single input model. And what I mean by that is that the only input into the model is the past history. We're going to be looking at techniques that do more than that today. And we're going to talk about the types of inputs that can improve your forecasts when extrapolation doesn't get the job done. So, as I said, extrapolation models, basically they're forecasting correlations or patterns. Techniques like exponential smoothing would concentrate on things like sales levels, trends, seasonal patterns, and try to extrapolate them from the past. Obviously, if we're going to extrapolate, we're going to have to assume that there's a continuity between the past and the future. The good news, it only requires a single input, which is the demand history. Typically, you'd be using something like sales figures or perhaps shipments, depending on the situation. Extrapolation methods in general are easy to apply, and they can be automated. And when you look around at how businesses forecast, you'll see a great deal of extrapolation being used, particularly in instances where we're doing large-scale forecasting. If I have 10,000 SKUs and I'm forecasting them by warehouse every month or every week, then there's often a lot of extrapolation being used. But they do have their limits. So there are things that you cannot get done with extrapolation. One is to capture and to forecast relationships between variables. So let's say that what you're trying to forecast is very impacted by price, and that the price for this item is going to change every month. And when the price changes, so does the demand. So if we just try to extrapolate from the past, we're not bringing price into the equation. We're going to see an electric power example a little later on, and there the weather is very important. So if the temperatures get hot, we tend to turn on the air conditioning and use more electricity. And if we just extrapolate from the past, then we're not bringing in the differences in temperatures from period to period and how that impacts our demand. Extrapolation methods also don't capture things that move around the calendar. So let's say that what we're trying to forecast is promoted, and that the promotions vary as to their timing. So some years we might promote in January, other years we promote in May, maybe one year we promoted in October. And the gist of it is that when we promote, it drives demand. And the fact that it moves around means that extrapolating it from the past, just treating it as, say, part of a seasonal pattern, doesn't work, okay? Now, on the other hand, if you always promote it at the same time every year, let's say that I work for a company that sells candy, and that every October we have a big Halloween promotion. It's not moving, the promotion is not moving around the calendar. It's always in October. So the fact that, yes, the promotion does drive demand is fine, but I don't need any special handling, because the fact that I always do it in October means that it can be picked up as part of a seasonal pattern. So again, as we're thinking about this, what can't we capture with extrapolation? We can't bring in what I'm going to refer to as explanatory variables, pricing information, measures of the economy, temperature, things like that. We can't bring or capture and forecast things that are moving around the calendar, say promotions, or maybe holidays, or maybe stockouts that occur. So these are all areas where extrapolation models are not going to get the job done. And to get the job done in these instances, we're going to need to use a multivariate model or a multiple input model. And that, of course, is today's topic. Now, I'm going to be using the Forecast Pro software to demonstrate how these inputs work and how they're applied. But everything that I'm going to be talking about can be utilized with other software that supports multivariate modeling. Now, in terms of techniques, we do have in this webinar series, probably the vast majority of our attendees are familiar with Forecast Pro. So we will mention the models that support multiple inputs in Forecast Pro. One is a new product forecasting technique called by analogy. It's really designed to help you forecast product launches. And the concept is that you have something that you want the launch shape, that is the sales pattern, to mimic. So an example might be when you launch a new pharmaceutical drug. Let's say I have a blood pressure drug, and it's just been approved and we're going to launch it. How do I go about forecasting that? Well, I might look at other blood pressure medications and see what sort of patterns emerge when they were launched. Typically, there'd be like a pipeline fill, so I'd have real strong sales as the pharmacies are stocking up. Then I'd have a drop, and then perhaps it would build as prescriptions are being filled and the pharmacies are reordering. But the idea is that we're mimicking some sort of shape, and it's for new products. We're not going to go into any depth here in this presentation, but I am going to, if this is of interest, point out that we do have webinars on new product forecasting. You can find them in the Forecast Pro archive. They're free to watch. And you can go on forecastpro.com. I'll actually show you that archive a little later during the presentation. But if you want to learn more about any of the topics that I'm covering, the webinar archive is a good place to start. And by analogy, models we go into depth in a webinar on new product forecasting. Another multiple input model is what's called the weighting transformation. We're going to take a look at this in a couple of slides, but basically it's an example of what's called a reverse transformation, where you define a set of weights, you take your input demand history, you divide by those weights, and you forecast that new de-weighted series. Why would that be useful? Well, in a few slides, I'll explain why that would be useful. It's one of many reversible transformations. There are others that are available both in Forecast Pro and elsewhere. Sometimes it's common for people to take a log or a square root of the data, depending on how the variation works with the time series at hand. And that's a reversible transformation as well. But again, we'll see an example in a minute. The last three I'm going to go through are sort of more traditional models, and they'll be kind of the core of this webinar. Event models. Event models allow you to capture things that move around the calendar, and we'll see this in action shortly. Dynamic regression. Regression models allow you to incorporate explanatory variables to bring in things like the price and the weather and economic indicators and other things of that ilk. Machine learning models. Machine learning models are relatively new for forecasting, and they are improving. And so 5 years ago, if we were talking about machine learning models for demand forecasting, they certainly exist, but they were mostly in research techniques, and their empirical performance is not nearly as good as it is now. So machine learning is, I think, a pretty exciting innovation. I think it has a lot of applications to demand forecasting, and I think it is going to get better and better. So there's kind of a question of the current state of the art. Machine learning and AI is sort of like that in other areas, if you think about it. Last week, I was in San Francisco, California, and it was the first time that I saw self-driving cars on public roadways. So I was walking down the street, and this car passed by. It had a bunch of cameras on top of the top of the car, and there was nobody behind the wheel. And it was going right down a street next to Golden Gate Park, and then it executed a right turn and drove out of sight. I wouldn't have seen that 5 years ago. It's using AI and machine learning to steer the car, and it's in beta test in San Francisco. I saw actually several different vehicles. I was there for a few days, but 5 years ago, we couldn't do that. We were talking about it. We were developing algorithms to help us have self-driving cars, but we weren't as far along. And I also didn't see self-driving cars on the highway. And I don't think they're quite ready for that, okay? So I sort of say machine learning for forecasting is a little like that. It's actually a very useful model at this point, and it's improving. And I think down the road, it's going to be even better. We're going to see some examples of machine learning using multiple inputs in this webinar. And BFS, my company, is working hard, just like the self-driving cars, to automate some of these multiple input models. And we expect things to get better and better going forward. But they're already pretty good. So let's look at our first input, and this is weights. And we can use weighting transformations for a variety of purposes. One is what I call trading day impacts. Now, trading day impacts can take different forms, but basically it is variation or demand that is being driven by things like how many days you're open. So let's say that you have a retail establishment. Let's say it's a repair shop or something like that, and I'm forecasting demand. And let's say that furthermore that I'm closed on Saturdays and Sundays, so I only work Monday through Friday. And I want to forecast the demand on a monthly basis. The number of Saturdays and Sundays in each month is going to have an impact on the demand because I'm only taking orders on Monday through Friday. Now, if you think about this, you might think, well, doesn't that just get handled as part of a seasonal pattern? But if you think about it carefully, it doesn't. Let's say, for example, that January starts on Saturday. Okay, how many days are in January? That's a pretty easy question. There's 31. How many Saturdays are in January? That's a little harder question. It depends on when the first day of January falls. If it falls on Saturday, I'd have 5 Saturdays, 5 Sundays, 5 Mondays, and 4 of every other day. If the first day in January fell on Monday, I'd have 5 Mondays, 5 Tuesdays, 5 Wednesdays, and 4 of every other day. So if you think about the first example, where we start on Saturday, and the second example, where we start on Monday, then everything being equal, I would expect to have more demand in the second case because I'm open more days. I have more working days. And typically, if you're being driven, if the number of working days for a given month varies from year to year, you can get a couple of percentage points more accuracy by taking it into account. And the weighting transformations are one way of doing that. Another common trading day impact is a 4-4-5 calendar. So this is a production calendar typically, where for convenience, we're going to forecast 12 periods per year, but rather than using the Gregorian calendar, rather than using January, February, March, we're going to have 12 periods per year, but each one is either going to have 4 complete weeks or 5 complete weeks. So instead of using the calendar, we're defining one where each period has either 4 or 5 weeks in it. And perhaps we need to reset, the factory once a week, and that's why we elected to do this. But if you're using a 4-4-5 calendar and the periods from year to year vary as to whether they have 4 or 5, this is an example of a trading day impact that you need to address. Unlike the number of working days, this one is big. There's typically a lot more demand, obviously, in a 5-week period than there is in a 4-week period. So it's important to get it right. So what is the input or the inputs to the model, and how does it work? Forecast Pro has this built in automatically, but I'm just going to show the concept on a spreadsheet. And row 4 here is demand. So this is what it's my monthly sales, and I'm trying to forecast it. And here's my recent sales in that column. Okay, and I've got demand history through March. And what I do is I create a second input, and that's the number of working days per month. So I take out a calendar, and I say in August of 2022, how many days were we open? And the answer is 21. What about September? Well, we opened 20 days in September. How about October? Etc. So I take out a calendar and I just record the number of working days per month for each period in the history. Furthermore, I take out, next year's calendar, or in this case, I guess this year's calendar, and I can go into the future and I can figure out how many working days I'll have in the future. So now what do? I've got my 2 inputs, my demand and my number of working days. Well, you divide your demand by the number of working days, and that creates this row here. You can think of this as a monthly observation of sales per day that you're open, so sales per working day. So in August of 2022, we were averaging 5.33 sales per working day. I can now forecast this series, say using an extrapolation method like exponential smoothing. And I take this series, it's the transform series, or the weighted series in this case, and I forecast it into the future. And notice that this question of, January from year to year, the number of working days might vary. That impacts my original series, but it doesn't drive demand in the transform series. It's accounted for because we divide it through by the number of working days. So this forecast doesn't have that issue. Whereas if I were to forecast this directly, it would. Now, so that's the good news, is we've got around the trading day problem. The bad news is I don't want to know sales per working day. I want to know the actual sales for each month. Well, that's pretty straightforward. All I need to do now is reverse the transformation. So we transform the data by dividing by the number of working days. We're going to reverse the transformation by multiplying back in, both for the history and for the forecast period. So a reversible transformation is a very simple, straightforward idea. You take the original series and you transform it, in this instance by dividing through by the number of working days. You forecast the resultant series, and then you finish by reversing the transformation, in this case by multiplying through. So weighting transformations can be useful for a variety of purposes. Trading day impacts are certainly where I see it most. On the other hand, let's say that the number of stores or the number of customers or other number ofs varies from period to period. I could use that same approach, and rather than looking at monthly sales, I could look at monthly sales per store or per customer and forecast that, and then reverse the transformation to get my total monthly forecast. Sometimes you see weights used for seasonal patterns, particularly with new products where it's hard to determine the seasonal pattern directly from the data. So perhaps we take an item that we think is similar and use the seasonal pattern there. I've certainly seen that done, and it's quite reasonable. We also have seen it used, or I've seen it used, to adjust the statistical forecasts in the future. So the concept is, maybe an extrapolation method works perfectly well to forecast the historic data, but I know that in the future something's going to happen. We're going to phase out this product. So maybe what I'll say is, 3 months from now, we're going to start to phase this out. So I'll generate a forecast, and then I'll take that forecast and I want to reduce it after 3 months. You can actually use weights to do this. What you would do is to create all the historic weights as 1. And if you think about it, if you divide something by 1, it doesn't change it. So the historic weights, because they're all 1, result in no change, and you generate a forecast just as you would if you hadn't transformed it. The difference is the weights in the future that you put in, you can put in anything you want. So perhaps I'll put in 1 for the first 3 months because I'm not planning on phasing it out until the 4th month. In the 4th month, maybe I'll put 0.8, and 5th month 0.6, and 0.4, 0.2, and then 0. And it would allow me to take that statistical forecast and phase it out. In the case of, say, a pharmaceutical drug where I know it's going to go off patent in 4 months, and I'm going to lose, say, 30% of my volume typically to a generic drug that's going to come onto the market. So I could use that same approach, and I could put in 1s for the first 4 months, and then maybe 0.7, which would pull my forecast down by 30%. So the main takeaway here is that weighting transformations are useful. There are certainly some very common uses for them, such as to adjust for trading days, number of stores or customers, etc. But really, you're only limited by your imagination. So if there's a case where a weighting transformation is useful, consider doing so. Okay, now the rest of the presentation is really going to focus around 3 common types of optional inputs or additional inputs, I should say. One is event schedules. These event schedules tell you when different types of events occur, and they're kind of on or off variables. So, for example, let's say that I have a promotion. Then any given month, I'm running that promotion or I'm not. So the promotion is on or off, okay? Or maybe, if I'm out of stock, either the product's in stock or not in stock. But it's kind of a binary thing. It will talk about common reasons to use events, but it's really a calendar or a schedule that you're going to bring into the forecasting process that tells when various types of events occurred. And we'll flesh that out in a minute. In distinction to an event schedule, you can also bring into forecasting models, if they support it, explanatory variables. Explanatory variables, I sometimes call them scale variables. Let's think about promotions. Let's say, again, in the event schedule approach, I'm thinking in terms of either a promotion is running or it's not. With an explanatory variable, it might be something like, we're using Google Ads to promote this product, and we have a certain spend. We have a certain amount of money each period that we're spending, and it varies. Maybe there are times of the year we spend more or less depending on what marketing deems to be wise. So rather than just saying we're promoting or not promoting, I actually want to bring in how many dollars each period of the history are we spending on Google Ads, and how many dollars are we budgeted to spend in the forecast period on a period by period basis. Okay. If I am trying to capture other things, like let's say I'm selling, I work for an electric power company, and the temperature is real important. So if it's hot, people run their air conditioning, I'm gonna sell more electricity. So it's not whether the weather is hot or not hot. It's sort of, I want something that's gonna tell me how hot was it, so that I can bring that in and forecast demand. And we'll show how that works shortly. The third category is something called dummy variables. This has typically been done in regression contexts. For those who have built regression models, you're probably familiar with dummy variables. It's somewhat similar to an event schedule in that it's usually binary, either on or off, but it's kind of a different approach, and we'll discuss this and where it's appropriate. We can use dummy variables in regression. We can also set it up to use them in machine learning. So again, we have what you can think of as three different types of common inputs into multiple input models: event schedules, explanatory variables, dummy variables. We'll be fleshing these out and showing an example very shortly. But before we do, let's consider where we can use them. Event models are a form of exponential smoothing that it allows you to bring in event schedules. Sometimes these models are referred to as event index models. But certainly, if you're using event models, you can use event schedules. But event models do not allow for explanatory variables. So I can't bring in the price from month to month, and they don't support dummy variables. Regression supports, it doesn't support event schedules. That's not part of regression, but it does support explanatory variables, and it does support dummy variables. Machine learning can support all three. We have designed our implementation, a little caveat here. The machine learning in Forecast Pro can accept all three. Other implementations of machine learning require you to define features. And some of these, you can directly throw into those other implementations. So things like explanatory variables and dummy variables, typically you can put right into a machine learning algorithm. Event schedules are a little different. You can create features that have the same impact as event schedules. And that's why we have the check mark here. That process is automated in Forecast Pro. If you're a data scientist, working in R or what have you, you may need to define the features and create some variables to do it, but you can accomplish the same thing. Okay, so let's take a closer look at dealing with events, one of our multiple inputs. So common events, probably one of the most common is product promotions. So were we promoting or not? Movable holidays, we're going to see an example of this in a second. If I'm forecasting something, let's say I'm forecasting Easter egg die kits. Okay, so that you use them to make colored Easter eggs. Then the demand is going to be very strong around Easter. And Easter obviously moves around from year to year. And so understanding the timing is going to be important. And I could treat that as an event. I can flag which period, whether I'm working with weekly data or monthly data or daily data, I can flag where Easter falls. And there are other examples of holidays that move around the calendar. Now, if you're doing monthly data, then yes, Easter, Rosh Hashanah, Ramadan are going to move around the calendar. If you're doing weekly data, other things are going to move around. The other holidays are going to move around the calendar as well. So we're going to see an example where we're going to forecast demand for beer, which is very driven by summer holidays. And in the United States, the 4th of July is a big summer holiday. The 4th of July is always in July. So if I'm working with monthly data, I don't have to worry about it changing periods. But it's not always in the same week every year. It can move. And so with weekly data, I need to explicitly accommodate the fact that the 4th of July may move around the calendar. Catastrophes, pandemics, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. This can alter, as everyone listening knows, COVID-19 altered basically everyone's demand patterns. We have several webinars on forecasting during COVID and post-COVID that are on the archive, and I'd encourage you to watch those if you are interested. But event models and event schedules can be very useful for things like that. Strikes, acquisitions, new legislation. There are lots of things that sort of fall in the category of an event has occurred which has changed demand, and it's either sort of on or off, okay? So let's now see how we use event schedules to improve our forecasts. So I'm going to leave the slides and we're going to go into Forecast Pro. And the first thing we're going to look at, I mentioned, is sales of beer. So what you're looking at now is sales of beer in a specific state in the United States. The green line on the screen is sales in six-packs. And this is a big name brand, okay? So it's one you would recognize. I almost always, when I'm approaching a forecasting operation, look at the graph and try to understand, what do I see? What do I see when I look at this graph? Well, the first thing that pops out at me is its weekly data, and it's very seasonal. So we're selling a lot more beer in the summers and not as much in the winter. So we've got a very strong seasonal pattern. What else do I see? Sales in six-pack seems to have a downward trend. Okay, so that's declining. Now, if I look at sales in 12-packs, they actually go up. And if I look at total sales in cans, there's not much of a trend at all. So looking at your data can often give you some insights here. All the data I'm going to use in today's webinar is real data. It's real client data. We have changed the dates associated with it, and we've changed the scale, but it's all real. In this case, this is a period of time where retailers were changing their floor space, and in the United States, and putting in sort of these big stores where they pack the 12-packs from the floor to the ceiling. And there was a shift away from sales in six-packs, and most of that volume just went into sales in 12-packs. Okay, so that's why these are trended. But what else do I see? So the other thing I can see, particularly if I was working for this company, when you work with your data, you tend to be able to interpret it better. The thing I can see is the summer holidays in the United States. There are three big summer holidays: Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day. And if you look at this, you can find those holidays every year. There's three big peaks during the summer. If you're really good at this, you might be able to find the Super Bowl, okay, which is the American football. But the concept here is there are these holidays. They have a big impact, and that's what we're gonna take a look at. Now, by default, Forecast Pro has generated a forecast for us, and it's used what's called expert selection. And expert selection in Forecast Pro currently is single input. So the only thing we're doing to get this red line forecast here is to extrapolate from the past. The forecast looks reasonable. It's seasonal. It continues the downward trend a little bit. You can even see sort of the 3 summer peaks here. Okay. If I add what's called the fitted values to this, and I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to zoom in, so we're going to take a closer look at the graph, and I'm going to add what's called the fitted values, which is how well it tracks. And if I look through this, I'm going to do actually 2 things. Okay, let's go into the forecast report, because I think this particular one looks like it built with machine learning, and it did. So this is a machine learning forecast. This explains the different methods it considered, and machine learning is sort of the first choice of the automatic approach. Exponential smoothing is the second choice. Box-Jenkins the third choice. So in this instance, we used machine learning. With machine learning, you sort of ignore the fitted values, and that's why some of this it looks so good. What I'm going to do actually is to change that. I have to drag something that the attendees can't see, but it's blocking my menu. And I'm going to go under the forecasting tab, and I'm going to switch this to exponential smoothing. So this is now an exponential smoothing model. It looks I can zoom out. It looks pretty similar. And again, now I've got these fitted values in, so I'm going to zoom in again. Now, what I'll find here is places where you kind of get the holidays wrong. Like here's a good example. The 4th of July was here on week 28, but we predicted it was going to fall in week 27. And what happened is probably last year, if I look at last year, it was in week 27 and it moved. Okay, but in general, you can see places where you might get things are off a little bit. Okay, and that's the holidays moving around. So what do I want to do? Well, we're talking about event schedules. If I had a schedule that told me where the holidays are, then I could adjust for them. And I could use, instead of the single input model of just using the demand history, I'd have 2 different inputs. The demand history as well as the event schedule. So to do that, I'm going to choose events. I'm going to go into this box here, and I'm going to choose a schedule that I set up for the holidays. So the schedule is shown here. I actually created it in Excel, but basically for every year, I specify that where Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day occur, I cover the history, so you can see it's quite a long list here, and I cover the forecast period. So this is an example of an event schedule. It's simply saying I've got 3 different kinds of events. I have Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. I go through the calendar and I specify, and the details aren't too important. You use something called an event code, and you specify where each of these things occur, and you do it to cover the history and the forecast period. I'm going to build this model by clicking this commit button. And when I do so, watch this peak and see what happens. So I'm going to commit. You see how now we're not missing the timing, which we were before. And what's happening, again, is that the smoothing model, the single input exponential smoothing model, couldn't capture the fact that events were moving around the calendar. And worse yet, in the future, I know where those holidays are going to occur, and the forecast may or may not have captured them depending on conditions at the end of the data set. So the event model adds real value here in this particular example. Now, there's also interpretation. If I go into the forecast report, This tells me how things, what model was selected and the details. We have a webinar on exponential smoothing and on event modeling that goes into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say that a smoothing model generates something called the final values, and it gives you an indication of the impact of different things. One of the things, if you use an event model, are final values for the indexes for, in this case, Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day. This particular model, when I look at these indices, what it tells me is that on Memorial Day, the index is 1.38, and this is multiplied into the forecast. If you multiply something by 1.38, you're going to raise it by 38%. And so the interpretation is, on the week that includes Memorial Day, we sell 38% more beer than in an average week. On the week that includes the 4th of July, we sell 76% more beer than on an average day. And on Labor Day, we sell 32% more. So the event model not only gives us a better forecast because it captures these holidays moving around, but it also tells us the impact of those. And that can be useful in its own right. Now, the other, on our little matrix chart that I showed previously, we mentioned that or machine learning rather, can also support event schedules. So let's see how that works. I'm going to drag this box that you can't see. I'm going to put it, well, you can't see that either, so I guess it doesn't matter, but I put it at the bottom. And I am going to go now to the forecasting tab and go into machine learning. And maybe I'll go back to the graph for this. Okay, so I'm going to go into manage. This is a dialog box to help you fit a machine learning model. It supports events as multiple inputs. It supports explanatory variables. I'm going to turn on this event schedule holidays, and I'm going to click OK. And this has built a machine learning model that uses both the historic data as well as that event schedule. I'm going to look at the forecast report for this one. Machine learning interpretation is less clear than most forecasting models. So this is the model detail. For those who are familiar with machine learning, this is it's a extreme gradient boosting technique that we've implemented in Forecast Pro. There's a question of the tree depth, which is 3 in this case, and the number of trees, which is 116, and the features that were included in the machine learning model. Again, Forecast Pro automates this. So you can specify the history, it's required, the demand history, but you can specify event schedules and explanatory variables, and they'll be entered as different features. There's a feature, notice that one of the features is holidays, 4th of July, and another holidays, Memorial Day, and holidays, Labor Day. And there are statistics that are associated with that feature. Let's just concentrate on the 4th of July, the gain being an important one. What the gain tells you is sort of the amount of impact that a given feature has relative to the other features in the model. So when I look at this, these values, what it doesn't tell me is you sell 76% more beer in the week that has the 4th of July. What it does tell me, though, is the 4th of July has a bigger impact than Memorial Day, and Memorial Day has a bigger impact than Labor Day. So what we're getting is relative strengths. The other features that are listed here have to do with dynamics, and things like how important is the seasonal pattern other than the holidays, and the trends, etc. And that's what these are. But the important thing is, again, the interpretation between an event model versus machine learning, you have a lot more interpretation in the case of the events. Let's go back to our slides for a second. Okay, we've already gone through the common types of events. And so the event schedules, we can use them with event models. And in Forecast Pro, you can use them with machine learning. If you're using machine learning outside of Forecast Pro, you can basically create features that do the same thing. They're categorical variables, so they indicate if things are occurring or not occurring. I think I called them binary previously. They're on or off. So it's either a week that includes Memorial Day or it's a week that doesn't. It's either a week that includes the 4th of July or it doesn't. If you're using Forecast Pro, you can create them interactively using what we call the event manager, or you can create them externally, like in Excel or a corporate database, and bring them in as helper variables. When using an event model, as we've seen, the final value of the event index captures the impact. When you're used with machine learning, there is some interpretation, but it's not really direct. It just tells you sort of the relative strengths of the different features that are currently being used. Okay, so the next type of input we're going to look at is explanatory variables. These fall into two categories. Internal variables, things that you have some control over. So say prices, promotions, advertising budgets, and things that are external to the company. So the weather, the economy, competition, demographics. So again, I have some control over the prices we charge for our products. Perhaps the weather is driving what we're trying to forecast, but I can't control the weather. And that's why we're thinking of prices as internal and things like the weather and the economy as external. Okay. Now, let's actually go into our second example. So I'm going to go back to Forecast Pro. And we're going to look at sales of electricity. Okay. Now, there's a question of what are we looking at? It's a very, this is sales of electricity in the Washington, D.C. area. Washington, D.C. gets very hot in the summer, and people run their air conditioning a lot and use a lot of electricity. And you can see that in the data. So these summer peaks are very high. They also change a great deal. So you can see like it went up from this year to this year, but it went down the following year. And what's happening is these are very much driven by temperature. And so if you have a hot summer, you sell a lot more electricity than if you have a mild summer. Sometimes when you're looking at weather, there's a question of, you know, what's the hottest month? And that can vary from year to year as well. If we use an extrapolation method here, let's see what the product shows. So in this case, it used exponential smoothing. And here's the unit error. It's called the MAD, or the mean absolute deviation, but it's just the unit error. On average, we were off by 76 units. And let's remember that number because we're going to try some multiple input models and see how that changes. Smoothing was recommended. Box-Jenkins was sort of second. Machine learning was third. But these were all single input models. Okay. I'm going to add our fitted values. And I'm going to point out that where we miss tends to be on these seasonal peaks. And furthermore, what you can see, if you look at, say, this one, okay, so we put the fitted value is here, the actual is here. So we undershot. Smoothing models are adaptive, and notice that the next peak has gone up. And that's because we undershot here. So it said, aha, the seasonal peak is getting bigger, let's forecast it bigger. And we still undershot, so it made it even bigger. And we still undershot, so it made it even bigger. But we had a mild summer, and we dramatically overshot it here. So the model's pretty good. It is tracking the seasonal pattern very well, but it's not getting certainly the peaks correct. And that's because they're temperature driven. And so what we want to do is to bring in an explanatory variable, an additional input, and we can bring in the weather. And so here are some variables we have. Air conditioning saturation rates, the percentage of households that have air conditioning. Cooling 66, cooling 76, and heating 55. These are temperature variables, and I'm not going to go into detail on how to calculate them. If you work for an electric power company, you would probably already know how they're calculated. I have seen these also used for things like food and beverage forecasting when temperature is important. But what we're after is basically an indication of how hot the month was. And we use a base temperature. So this is cooling 66. And what I want to understand is how hot was each month? And particularly, did it go over 66 degrees on any given day? And how much over did it go? So what you do is you take, for example, let's say I'm doing this month, which is August, our hottest month. I take every day in August. If it was over 66 degrees, I would increment this variable by however many degrees over 66 it was. And if it was 66 degrees or less, then I would increment that month by 0 for that day. So if you do that, what you end up with is zeros in the wintertime when there really are no days that you go over 66 as an average daily temperature, and much larger values in the summer that reflect how hot the weather was. So again, there's a lot written on that. If this is of interest to individuals attending the webinar, by all means, look into it. But it's a pretty common way of getting sort of the intensity of the weather period by period. I also have disposable income. I guess the concept here is if you have more money, you can buy more electronic gadgets and use more electricity. But the weather are really the important ones here. Okay, so let's start by saying, how do we use this in machine learning? Okay, and so I'm going to go into here. This is, again, our exponential smoothing forecast. I'm going to turn off our fitted values. And I'm going to go into machine learning. And I'll go into manage. And you'll notice I've got all my explanatory variables here. And I'm going to do this. We want to save some time for Q&A. So I'm going to do this pretty quickly. I'm just going to add everything and let the machine learning algorithm figure out what's important. Okay, so I'll go ahead and click OK. And it generates a forecast. If you were watching the screen, you probably saw this come down quite a bit. But this is the machine learning forecast. If I go under reports and I look it up, what you can see is our most important variable, our feature, is cooling 66, and the second one is cooling 76. Then we've got a seasonal lag, so that's another seasonal dynamic term. Then we have the heating. So the cooling and heating degree variables are very important. The other dynamics are there, but not as important. Disposable income and air conditioning is down here at the very bottom, so they don't seem very important at all. Again, not a lot of interpretation on the different features other than their relative importance. If I go back to our forecasting, I can build a similar model in regression. Let me go back to the graph. We'll go under regression. I can include explanatory variables. I'm going to cheat a little bit and just do the weather because our machine learning indicated that those were the important ones. I'll do automatic dynamics and click OK. And this is now a forecast using regression. If I look at the report, I'm going to see here's the model. And the model has coefficients. And these are interpretable, okay? Because essentially, if you look at the regression equation, this will tell you both, is it pushing things up or down? So these are all positive. It's saying that they are increasing demand. If they were negative, they'd be decreasing demand. And their values, when compared to the scale of the data, you can interpret. It's beyond the scope of this webinar, but we have a webinar on regression where we do go into that. So I'm going to wrap this up at this point because the clock is ticking, as they say. And let's go back to our slides and wrap it up. Okay. The only other variable that we haven't looked at is what's called dummy variables. They are used for a variety of purposes. They're variables that you create often using zeros and ones, but you're not strictly limited to that. But the zeros are important. And so this is a little regression equation. For those who are not familiar with regression, don't worry too much about this. For those who are, that's really why I put it up here. And what this says is our sales are going to be equal to some explanatory variables, and they have coefficients. That's this capital B. There's the dummy variable, which has a coefficient of this lowercase b. There's a constant term. There's an error. Think about this variable that's all zeros with one non-zero point, where let's say it's the value 1 and 0 afterwards. This is called a spike, and it only has an impact when it's a 1, because every other period it's b times 0, and it doesn't change the rest of the regression. On the one period where it's the value of 1, it's going to move demand up or down by b, depending on if b is positive or negative. It's kind of the equivalent of throwing away a data point. Another common one is a shift, sometimes called a step dummy, where it's sort of before and after. You put in zeros, and then after the fact, you could put in ones. And again, before it occurs, it doesn't have an impact. Afterwards, it does. A seasonal dummy is common as well. Dummy variables can be used in regression, and they can be used in machine learning. And they can be useful in a variety of circumstances. They're created outside of Forecast Pro, usually in either a spreadsheet or a database. They usually consist of zeros and ones, but they don't have to. When we use with regression models, so this is similar to explanatory variables, their coefficients capture the impact of the variable and can be interpreted. When used with machine learning, the impact is not as directly interpretable, but the relative is. Okay, so again, we've seen these three different types of additional inputs, and we've talked about and shown how they can be applied using different methods, and that's really the core of our presentation. So just wrap up a couple of things. There are times when you can improve upon extrapolation, when extrapolation simply doesn't get the job done. And in those cases, you want to consider using multiple input models. If you're using the Forecast Pro software, we strive hard to automate the model building process, particularly as it pertains to event models, machine learning, and regression. Our approaches are much more automated than most software packages, and it's really something that our methodology is something that we work on constantly, and we're sort of leaders in automating these types of approaches so that make them accessible to non-data scientists, so that general business people can use them and they add value. Okay, I do want to mention that using a multiple input model requires more effort than just using an extrapolation method or using expert selection. However, after you've built the model, maintaining it is usually very simple. It's usually just updating your inputs and rerunning the model you had before. So again, there is effort involved. You need to create the inputs. You need to think about it and understand it. But once you've set it up, then you're good to go. Okay, before we take questions, I'm just going to run through a couple of informational slides. We do have a 3-day workshop. It's an online workshop. It's coming up in May. If you haven't done one of these, we have the core of the workshop is 4.5 hours a day. We're going to look at different forecasting methods and different parts of your forecasting process. We're going to explain how the methods work conceptually. We won't go into a whole bunch of Greek equations or anything like that, but we want to get across the distinctions and the pros and cons. And we use lots of examples to show how you apply them. If you're interested in this, by all means, visit forecastpro.com, and there is space available at the moment, although we do limit attendance. So if you want to attend, I'd encourage you to visit the website and sign up. Again, if you're not currently using Forecast Pro, it is the software that we use today to illustrate all of our examples. If you want to learn more about Forecast Pro, we'd love to tell you more about it. I'd encourage you to visit the website. There's a lot of information there. The best way to learn, though, is to request a live demo. And so we'll jump on to Zoom or Teams or whatever the salespeople want to use. And we'll walk you through the Forecast Pro. You can even use your own data. We also do offer free trials, although I would say get a live demo first, because that'll allow you to use that trial more effectively. So if you're interested, let us know. You can even just put something in the chat box right now and we have somebody contact you. Again, we'd love to teach you more about it. Okay, I'm going to pause before the questions for 1 second, and just because this seminar kind of went into a lot of topics that I covered very quickly, I want to point out on forecastpro.com, if you go under resources, there are a bunch of resources you should be aware of. One is the webinars. And these are all the past webinars. When I said things like you can watch, one on exponential smoothing or event models or machine learning, you'll find these webinars here. They're free. You just click on them and it runs it. If you want to see the full breadth, we also have a YouTube channel. This is our YouTube channel, and we have a wide array of educational webinars, including modeling during COVID, and lots of other topics. That's also accessible on the resources tab. You can click through to YouTube. So again, if you're interested in any of these topics, I really encourage you. It's all free and it's all available. Okay, so we're running a little late, but we will go ahead and run a little over if there are some questions. So Sabina, do we have some questions?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions that came in. And as you said, I know we're past the scheduled time, but we'll, for those who can stay on, we'll just take a couple. And just a reminder, if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with an email, and this is also being recorded. So if you have to hop off, we'll send you the recording next week and you can catch up on the Q&A. But I'll get right into it just to keep things moving. The first question, actually, a couple people asked variations of this, and it's about sort of seasonality. So how would you take care of seasonal products that sell at certain points throughout the year and then have flat demand during other periods of the year?
Okay, so that's a good question. I would answer that in a couple of different ways. One is if you're using Forecast Pro, we do support a model that is, let's see, what do we call it? Call it the SALT model. It's a form of exponential smoothing for data that is not trended, but has seasonality at certain times of the year. And so think of like, snow shovels. We only sell them in the winter, and during the summer it's flat. So there's seasonal patterns in the winter, but not in the summer. Or say a ski resort lift tickets. Okay, we're only open certain times of the year. So you can use a model that's designed for it. And the form of exponential smoothing called NaCl, it's for non-additive with a constant level, is a model. I think we actually developed that model. It's the only one that exists. As far as I know, it's the only commercial implementation, but it's pretty straightforward. The other thing you could do is use events. And so you would create event schedules to capture the seasonal pattern. And during the months where you have flat demand, you would put in zeros, as in no event is occurring. So let's say, let me flesh that out with an example. Let's say that we're flat except for January, February, and March, where the seasonal pattern occurs. You would create an event schedule, which is 0 in all months except for January, February, and March. And you would flag January's as a specific type. So let's call it a type 1, February is type 2, and March is a type 3. And then you could build an event model or a machine learning model, and it would give you a seasonal pattern just for those months. Very similar to the example we ran with the holiday schedule. Next question, Sabina.
Yeah, so actually, funny enough, the next question came up when you were kind of going through that holiday event schedule. And they asked, when you load event schedules, do they need to load both the historical event schedule and future event schedule?
Okay, so that's a good question. The quick answer is yes. So when you're building an event model, the events have to have occurred historically. So you know what the model is doing is measuring the impact that it had on the history. So it does require that that the events have occurred historically. If you do not list the events in the future, then the assumption is they're not going to occur in the future. If you do list the events in the future, then the forecast will reflect that they will occur in the periods that you've specified. So the way I would think about this is a lot of times, let's say you have something. I did some work with a telephone company in the Caribbean at one point, and their big problem was tropical storms. So they'd have a big storm come up, and all the tourists would make a whole bunch of phone calls and get off the island. And then after the storm passed by, they'd come back and demand would go to normal. So the storms really were big events, and they knew where the storms occurred historically, but they didn't know when they were going to occur in the future. Okay, so what they did was to do event schedules that shows where they occurred historically. They generated a forecast that assumes there are no storms in the future. And then when they presented that forecast, they said, but this assumes there's no storms. And if we do have storms, then we're going to have the demand will change significantly. And furthermore, we could look at those event indices and sort of tell them the impact of the storms. So we looked at with the 4th of July, it was like 1.76, and we said it's 76% more beer in that month, or actually it was a week. And you do the same thing here. So you could run the event model. No, you don't know if there's going to be a storm in a given period in the future. So you have to, as part of the forecast submission, you have to say, this is assuming no storms. In the event of a storm, here's what we can expect. Next question.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, the next question, they asked if you could quickly demonstrate creating a weighting transformation for business days in Forecast Pro.
Okay. Sure. So let me, instead of creating it, because it would be truly boring for you to watch me create it, I'll show you one.
Okay.
And in fact, I can probably show you the one that we used. You will have to watch me fumble around slightly. Okay. So let's do this. Just trying to think of where I have one. Okay, I said I wouldn't bore you with watching, but I'll do it anyways. So let's do it this way. Okay, this is a time series. It's a very old one. It comes from the Box-Jenkins textbook. It's a very famous series, but it's monthly. And this is international flights out of Heathrow on a monthly basis. If I wanted to add a weighting field, I would give it a name. So maybe I'll just call it weights. And then I would give it, this is just some descriptor information. So I'll have that match. And then I put in the weights. So if it was the number of working days per period, maybe it looks something like this, but I just typed them in and I would make sure it covers the history. This is a long history. There we go. Okay, again, the values don't really matter too much. And then I'd look in the future and I'd take out the future calendar and put in whatever the values happen to be. So again, think of it as another input. If you're bringing in data in Excel, it's another column or row. If it's a corporate database, then maybe it's something you can pull with a query. But it will be set up in the same fashion as other inputs. The other thing is if you go in Forecast Pro, if you go into the help system, you'll find both instructions on how to set up data, as well as a lot of sample data file, including the one I used in the demonstration, which I was not able to figure out on this particular machine where I would find it. So apologies for that. Okay, do we have other questions or should we conclude?
We do have a couple more questions. Just for the sake of time, I think we'll just take one more. And that question is someone asked, how do you connect explanatory variables with the forecast model?
Okay, so these are all Forecast Pro questions, which is fine. But I think what I'll do is to just illustrate how it's done in Forecast Pro. Okay, so when you're reading data in, you do it through the data manager. And the data manager has a row for the historic data. And in this case, I'm reading it in from a spreadsheet. It also has a row for explanatory variables. And in this case, I'm reading it in from a different spreadsheet. But I could also read it in from databases, et cetera. But the idea is when and this will work with other applications, there's going to be a way of bringing in data. But explanatory variables are basically external data that you're creating, and you bring them in the case of Forecast Pro, through the data manager. There's also a row here called helpers, and event schedules, which we also talked about, are brought in through there, as are the weights. Okay, so, and again, in Forecast Pro, if you are using that, I go under Help and Program Reference. Okay, and that will bring up the reference manual, and you've got a whole chapter on setting up your data, and including things like explanatory variables, et cetera. And there's also sample data files that come, and that's often a good way to do it. Take a quick look in the document to get a feel for what we're doing, and then pull up a sample data file, take a look at it, and then create your own. Okay,
Great.
So again, I know we ran a bit over. Sabina mentioned there are still a couple of other questions, but we will reply to those by email. I just want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I hope you got something out of it. And if you do have follow-up questions, we're always here to help. So just let us know.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.